Okay, research into prejudice/discrimination regarding race, ethnicity, and/or gender. The term racism and its derivative term racist. People who use these terms literally don't have a clue as to what they mean or the concepts and phenomena they are trying to describe. In point of fact, these terms have no meaning. They don't exist linguistically. They are false vernacular and colloquial propaganda terms that the corporate media created and the forces behind the scenes controlling the media in other aspects of our society call the forces the deep state or whatever, but I will get into that angle below and later, have been using to program and indoctrinate the general populace for more than 50 years now. They have been systematically and longitudinally indoctrinating people to accept a Jewish invention, a Jewish ism, which I have named victimism, which functions, among other things, as a substitute for traditional religion. The technical term for racism, racist, from the social sciences is ethnocentrism, which occurs when members of a group, usually racial, ethnic, religious, national, very naturally consider members of their own group superior to all other competing groups, regardless of knowing little to nothing about those outgroups. The invalid term racism attempts to describe attitudes. The importance of the book Opinions and Personality by M. Brewster Smith, Jerome S. Bruner, and Robert W. White. Back in the late 70s, I was fishing around in the University of Miami stacks when I stumbled upon this book. This book had a profound influence on my ideas about how humans process political, moral, and religious attitudes, and motivated me a few years later when I matriculated to Cal to study the new interdisciplinary field of political psychology, with several of its pioneers, including Herbert McCloskey, Philip Tetlock, and Aaron Wildavsky. I worked as an undergraduate research assistant for all three and others like Mervyn Friedman below. What most people fail to understand is that ethnocentrism, or as they call it, racism, is a concept that attempts to describe an attitude or syndrome of attitudes. In social science, attitudes are defined by the ABC model of attitudes. All attitudes have three components: an affective or emotional component, A, behavioral component, B, and a cognitive component, C. The cognitive component is a learned tendency to evaluate certain things in a certain way. Example, attitudes towards spiders. The affective component would sound like, I am scared of spiders. The behavioral component would be something like, I will avoid spiders and scream when I see one. And the cognitive component would be something like knowledge or belief about spiders. I believe spiders are dangerous and I will avoid them. The affective component is primary. If the affective component is lacking, you do not have a true attitude, and therefore you do not have a true case of racism, ethnocentrism. If the affective component is present, but the cognitive component is based on hard evidence, scientific research, statistics, random sampling, lifelong experience, then again, you do not have a case of racism, ethnocentrism. There is nothing prejudicial or discriminatory about cognitive conclusions when they are based on statistics, lifelong repetitive personal experience, or hard evidence of any kind. The term racism is a negative feeling toward the objects of one's racism, not a thought. Excuse me. The thought motivates the feeling, but if you lack the feeling part, you lack the attitude, and therefore you're not racist. The most interesting aspect of the Smith, Bruner, and White studies is that they correlated political and other attitudes with measurable cognitive and personality traits, and discovered that attitudes towards political and other subjects serve a psychological function for all of us, a very important psychological function. In their series of studies, they found that any political attitude can serve one of four distinct functions for the person holding the attitude in question. 1, an object appraisal function. 2, a value expressive function. 3, a social adjustive function. And 4, an ego defensive or externalization function. The first two functions, object appraisal and value expression, are considered psychologically healthy functions, while the last two, the social adjustive and the ego defensive function, are considered psychologically unhealthy, at least by me. Object appraisal serves the knowledge function, based on honest and objective assessment of the target of the attitude. It is based on logic, reason, and evidence. This is a healthy attitude function. Value expression serves the purpose function of helping us in the expression of our own self-concept and seeks to present who we are to the world. This is also a healthy function. The social adjustive function helps us to identify with a group and to gain group approval. It basically serves the function of conformism. We assume an attitude or series of attitudes, not because we really feel that way, but in order to be accepted, liked, respected, admired by others, whether or not we truly feel the way we present ourselves to that group. The ego expressive or externalization function serves to help us deal with inner psychological problems and conflicts, to protect ourselves from disturbing self-knowledge, projection, displacement, repression, or denial. Object appraisal and value expression functions allow us to see the object of any attitude honestly. When an attitude serves a social adjustive function, it implies the holder of the attitude is willing to distort his view of the attitude object, at least to state it that way and to behave that way, and therefore is willing to distort his reality and a subset of the external world in order to conform and be liked and accepted. When an attitude serves an ego defensive or externalization function, we will allow our personal inner problems to distort our perception of the attitude object and/or other subsets of the world. Other legitimate ways of making very general statements about groups are the concept of modal personality and national character, both of which have a long history in social science research. I'm making that point to show that these are statistical concepts and that they do not display, and the study of them, the description of them, the feelings about them do not describe an attitude. One angle on my critique of post-mortem America and Americans is that there is virtually no one left in this country whose attitudes are not exclusively founded upon a social adjustive and/or ego defensive function. In other words, today's crop of Americans constitute a true herd. My use of the term herd as a technical term of my critique is different from any previous use of the term, including that of Friedrich Nietzsche, Jose Ortega, David Felton, Robin Greene, David Dalton, Holly Sklar, Edward Abbey, John Gray, C.S. Lewis, Jean-Francois Revel, Robert Payne, Dick Meyer, The Club of Rome, David Ehrenfeld, Alan Bloom, Colin Wilson, Norman Podhoretz, Hilton Kramer, Charles Murray, Roger Kimball, Jean Baudrillard, Edward Shills, Irving Kristol, James Q. Wilson, Robert Bork, Ralph Nader, Robert R. MacArthur, or others. In my use of the term, everyone in this country, in fact, everyone on this planet is a member of the herd. I'm not included since I'm not on this planet often enough. When I hear the word racism, racist, I immediately think of the word emails. There is no such thing as the word emails, plural with an S, or the word email used as a verb. After all, what does the E in the word email stand for? The E stands for electronic. The full form is electronic mail. The term is one of those where the singular and the plural form are the same, like deer. You don't say, look at those 10 deers in that field over there. You say, look at those 10 deer over there. Or look at that one deer over here. So one cannot send a bunch of emails, plural, only a bunch of email messages or email letters. Why is this important? No reason. It's important to me as a retired IT guy because it annoys me interminably. The reason it's important to society is that it is one small example of what a few of my projects are about. The degree to which it demonstrates how post-mortem Americans take everything for granted, unless, of course, as I always say, they can either eat it, fuck it, or accelerate it. More importantly, still, it shows how not only do post-mortem Americans fail to examine any of the assumptions they base ideas, opinions, and attitudes upon, But even worse, they're not even aware of the concept assumption to begin with. So they basically take everything for granted. I call this corruption via comfort. This is one of the things that makes me a freak in intellectual, literary, and philosophical history. I instinctively examine all the assumptions I am basing any truth-functional statement I am thinking over, or considering, or arguing out with myself on. Then I list all the assumptions buttressing those assumptions, and then those assumptions on and on backwards in an infinite regress. There are multiple infinite regresses going on in my head at any one time, which should help people who know me understand why I'm so psychotic most of the time, some of the time. Formal social scientific research into racism began in the 1930s with the Bennington study, Mervyn Friedman and the Bennington College study. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to work as research assistant for some of the greatest social scientists in the history of the field, something that I'm very proud of, and it formed a big part of my psyche. That period was one of my most formative intellectually. One of them was Dr. Mervyn Friedman, professor of psychology at San Francisco State University. Dr. Friedman was part of the follow-up team for Theodore Newcomb, the principal investigator of the Bennington study. That study took place over many decades, starting in the early 1930s, and sought to show how college education can induce attitude change through indoctrination of students, and how permanent those changes can be. It was a longitudinal study over multiple generations. It might still be going on. The main attitudes that were studied were related to ethnocentrism. This study is revolutionary because it was the first attempt by serious social science to take up the issue of ethnocentrism and racial and ethnic prejudice and discrimination. After working with Dr. Friedman, I had social scientific foundation to learn about these issues further. And here's some of the things that I learned further. Consensus research on race and ethnicity at this stage of history very strongly suggests that ethnocentrism, or racism, is hardwired, probably genetically, into the Homo sapiens psyche. There are no exceptions. Muzaffar and Carolyn Sharif and the Robbers Cave experiments. I've said many times, in response to dipshits talking bullshit about things they know nothing about, like racism, that 5% of Americans are racist and the other 95% lie. The Sharifs and co-researchers demonstrated that this is a fact in their famous Robbers Cave experiments. They took a group of boys to summer camp at a park in Oklahoma called the Robbers Cave Park and divided them up into groups. They allowed the boys to build up a sense of group cohesion and identity to the point where they were competing aggressively and violently towards the other groups. They didn't allow them to develop it. They actually fostered and encouraged group cohesion and group identity among the groups of boys. Once the in-group identities had been absorbed by the boys, they naturally became very ethnocentric about the other groups, making up stereotype stories and inventing slurs to describe the other groups. Elsewhere, I have posted or embedded lots of pictures of this. You could see the kids carrying signs belittling the opposing groups. Violently. Once the in-group identities had been absorbed by the boys, they naturally became very ethnocentric, making up stereotype stories and inventing slurs to describe the other groups. A few years later, the Sharifs and their associates replicated the experiment at a summer camp in Connecticut with similar results. Since then, dozens of researchers have attempted to replicate the Robbers Cave methodology. One of the very important results of the study is the conclusion that humans are hardwired, very probably genetically, to be ethnocentric or racist. What this means to American idiots and others, if there are any others left, among other things, is that all racial, ethnic, religious, and national groups are racist or ethnocentric toward other groups by nature. In other words, it is not possible for human beings to not be racist. People who use these terms ignorantly, which anybody uses the term is ignorant of what I've just described, are failing to make a very important distinction. The distinction on the one hand of the cognitive, emotional, affective attitude components, and on the other hand, the behavioral component Okay? So, very simply put, a person can be a racist. They can have racist or ethnocentric feelings. They can have a feeling world where they don't like, but that is completely different from behavior, ethnocentric behavior. They could never, if they never speak about their ethnocentrism, if they never discriminate against any individuals or groups who are part of that group that they are ethnocentric about, that still means that they're ethnocentric. What Americans fail to understand is that these bizarre groups like neo-Nazis or white supremacist groups, or etc., show their behavior, which demonstrates their attitude toward blacks, Jews, or whatever. But there are people who have those attitudes but would never behave that way, either because they're afraid of being rejected from their in-group, or maybe they have, like, moral conviction, and you can't help feeling the way you feel about anything in the world. You can't help having an attitude, whatever that attitude is, toward what you have the attitude towards. I mean, you can go into therapy and solve the underlying ego defensive and emotional issues that create that. Like the F scale studied by the guys who wrote, I forgot the name of the book, I'll describe it later. So there are lots of people who have the racist feelings, 95%, as I say above, but 5% are expressing it like the wackos. A perfect example from my personal experience of exactly what I'm talking about is some of the things that Mervyn Friedman told me personally of his experiences in Sweden. He lived in Sweden for several years. He met his Swedish wife there and married her. During his experience in Sweden, he told me that what he saw, and he did studies in paper and pencil attitude tests using attitude scales of ethnocentrism, race and ethnic prejudice, racism, whatever you want to call it. And what he found was that Swedes were intensely anti-Semitic. They did not like Jews. On the other hand, that was their feeling world. Okay? On the other hand, they would never express this behaviorally in any way. They would never discriminate against Jews. They would never talk in a discriminatory fashion against Jews, except maybe in personal social groups or whatever. Because what he said was that the Swedes were even more emotionally reserved than the Brits. So there's a perfect example of the difference between the affective and cognitive component of an attitude and the acting out of the attitude in the behavioral component. Thank you.